On the evening of February 23, 1982, at approximately 9:40 p.m., militia officers responding to an emergency call arrived at an interior road in Bitsevsky Forest Park, a wooded reserve of several hundred hectares in Moscow's southwestern Cheremушki district. What they found when they reached the location was a scene they could assess quickly, and a scene that would take years to fully understand. A man lay dead beside a parked car on the dirt road. A woman lay dead approximately 15 meters away. A second man stood near the car, not running, not concealed, making no effort to alter what had occurred. Before we continue, if you find yourself drawn to these stories, the documented truth behind the Cold War's most consequential intelligence operations, the families and careers destroyed, the decisions that altered the course of history, subscribe and turn on notifications. Every week we go deep into the cases that shape the modern world, told with the detail and seriousness they deserve. Now, let's talk about how a brutal night in a Moscow park accidentally unraveled what French intelligence would later call the greatest espionage achievement of the Cold War. The man who remained was Vladimir Vetrov. He was 49 years old, compact in build, dark-haired with a broad face and the contained, deliberate bearing of a man accustomed to professional environments that required composure above all else. He had spent more than 20 years in the employ of Soviet intelligence. When the militia officers asked for his occupation, he gave the answer that tens of thousands of Soviet citizens employed by the KGB gave when asked the same question by civilian authorities. He worked for a foreign trade organization. He provided his name and his identification documents. He answered the officers' initial questions briefly. He said very little else. The officers at the scene had no particular reason to look beyond what was immediately visible. 2 people were dead. The man who had not fled was the evident suspect. The evidence required no elaborate interpretation. They detained Vetrov, secured the scene in accordance with standard criminal investigation procedures, and opened a case for double homicide. The matter appeared to be exactly what it looked like. What happened next, across the weeks and months that followed that February evening, would prove that assumption catastrophically wrong. Not for the militia officers who had made it. They could not have known what lay beneath the surface of what they found. But for the Soviet intelligence apparatus that had employed Vladimir Vetrov for more than 2 decades, and for the Western intelligence services that had, for the 14 months immediately preceding that night, been receiving from him a stream of documentation that would permanently alter their understanding of how the Cold War was actually being fought. The investigators who built the murder case would, in the course of building it, pull a thread that unraveled something neither they nor anyone else had anticipated finding. Vladimir Vetrov's murder trial accidentally became the mechanism by which France's most consequential Cold War asset was identified and executed. Vladimir Vetrov was born in Moscow on August 16, 1932, the second child of a factory worker named Nikolai and a schoolteacher named Anna, in a city that was still being comprehensively reorganized by the machinery of Stalinist modernization. The Moscow of his childhood was a city of queues at bread counters, of block wardens who maintained lists and filed reports, of apartment committees that noted who came and went and with whom, of conversations conducted at lower volume whenever they touched subjects the state had designated sensitive, which in Stalin's Soviet Union was most subjects. The surveillance that shaped Soviet daily life in the 1930s and 1940s was not abstract to a child growing up inside it. It was the texture of ordinary existence, absorbed so completely that it required no explicit instruction to understand. What that childhood also offered, to a boy of demonstrated intellectual ability, was genuine access to upward mobility through the Soviet educational system. Vetrov excelled in mathematics and showed an aptitude for languages that set him apart within his school cohort. He graduated in 1950 from a Moscow secondary school with academic results that opened the path to higher technical education, and he enrolled in a Moscow Engineering Institute in the early 1950s, studying communications and electronics engineering. He graduated in approximately 1955 with the technical credentials that the expanding Soviet state security apparatus was specifically seeking for a program it was building within its Foreign Intelligence Directorate. By the mid-1950s, the KGB's first chief directorate, the arm of the State Security Committee responsible for foreign intelligence, had identified a structural gap in its collection capabilities. It was producing substantial intelligence through human sources, signals intercepts, and open source analysis, but the specific category of Western military and defense technology was proving difficult to penetrate systematically. The Soviet military-industrial complex required information about Western radar systems, guidance technologies, aerospace materials, communications equipment, and the semiconductor and computing technologies beginning to define the next generation of military capability. Producing officers who could collect this intelligence required something different from the standard intelligence training pipeline. Technically educated individuals who could move through Western scientific and professional environments with genuine credibility, evaluate what they saw with real comprehension, and identify and cultivate sources within institutions whose security measures were calibrated against traditional intelligence threats. Vetrov's combination of engineering education, language facility, and social capability suited this requirement precisely. He was recruited into the KGB in the late 1950s and assigned to the first Chief Directorate's Scientific and Technical Intelligence apparatus, the program known in operational shorthand as Line X, later formalized as Directorate T. The training pipeline he entered was extensive, covering standard intelligence tradecraft, surveillance and counter-surveillance techniques, communication security protocols, asset recruitment methods, counterintelligence awareness, as well as additional preparation in the technical fields his targets would occupy and the social environments he would be required to navigate. When he emerged from this preparation, he had spent several years becoming something genuinely difficult to produce, an intelligence officer who could plausibly inhabit the professional world of a Western-educated engineer. The apartment where Vetrov and his wife Svetlana lived in Moscow during the years before and after his Paris posting was located in one of the residential districts of southwestern Moscow that housed a significant proportion of the city's scientific and professional population, the workers, academics, engineers, and administrators who constituted the Soviet technical intelligentsia. The apartment was a standard Soviet three-room flat of approximately 60 square meters, a sitting room that doubled as a space for reading and professional paperwork in the evenings, a bedroom, a smaller room that served as a study, a kitchen of the modest dimensions, standard to Soviet apartment construction of the period, and a bathroom. The building was one of the mass-production residential blocks that had been constructed throughout Moscow's expanding outer districts during the late 1950s and 1960s, functional and interchangeable, indistinguishable from its neighbors along the street. Svetlana, whose background and maiden name have not been established in English-language documentation of the case, worked professionally throughout the years of their marriage, a circumstance that was standard rather than exceptional among Soviet professional couples of this period and social class, where two incomes were both economically necessary and institutionally expected. The nature of her specific professional work is not documented in publicly available sources, though the biographical profiles of women in her social position in Moscow during this period, wives of KGB technical intelligence officers, members of the Soviet scientific and professional class in the city's residential southwestern districts, typically included employment in education, medicine, scientific research institutes, or the administrative apparatus of the same institutions that employed their husbands. What is documented is that she maintained her employment through the years of the operation she knew nothing about, through the murder conviction and the beginning of Vetrov's imprisonment, and through the second set of proceedings that ultimately resulted in her husband's execution. The biographical detail that the available documentation of the Vetrov case provides about Svetlana as an individual is thin in a way that reflects the specific gaps in publicly available records rather than any deliberate editorial decision. The Kostin Renaud biography, the primary account of the case, focuses necessarily on the intelligence dimensions of what Vetrov did and on the institutional consequences for the Soviet and French intelligence communities. The domestic life of the woman who lived in the same apartment during the operational period, who had dinner with her husband on evenings when he had spent the preceding hours photographing classified documents, who spent those years unaware that her household had been converted into the operational base of a KGB officer running himself as a foreign intelligence asset. This is documented only in its outlines. She inhabited the case as a secondary victim of almost invisible magnitude, present in its consequences, almost entirely absent from its documentation. What the available records do establish about the Vetrov household in the years leading to the Paris posting is the professional life that organized its rhythms. Vetrov commuted from the southwestern residential district to the first chief directorate's operational facilities, which were located not at Lubyanka Square, the KGB's central Moscow headquarters, but at Yasenevo, in the city's southwestern outskirts, a campus purpose-built for foreign intelligence work and accessed by KGB personnel through a combination of institutional transport and the ordinary Moscow public transit network. He worked regular professional hours analyzing incoming technical intelligence and preparing assessments for use by Soviet defense industry planners. He returned in the evenings to the apartment on the southwestern side of the city, where Svetlana would have prepared dinner and where, in the early 1970s after the Paris years, their son Vladek grew up in the ordinary domestic texture of a Soviet professional family: homework, evening meals, weekends in the parks, school mornings. The Paris posting that preceded this routine came in the mid-1960s, when Vetrov received his first foreign assignment under commercial cover, listed in official documentation as a representative of a Soviet foreign trade organization. He was then in his early 30s. Paris in the mid-1960s was one of the most productive operating environments in Western Europe for Line EX, a city with a substantial concentration of French defense industry, NATO-adjacent research institutions, and the kinds of multinational professional conferences and gatherings at which Line X officers could develop the contacts their operational tasking required. The French intelligence environment, while competent, was also navigating the particular complications of France's complicated relationship with NATO during the de Gaulle era, and the gaps this created were actively exploited by Soviet intelligence throughout the decade. The Paris years lasted until approximately 1970, and they left marks of the specific kind that the first chief directorate's training programs could prepare its officers to manage professionally but could not fully prevent. An officer required to move convincingly through Parisian professional society had to engage with it authentically enough to be accepted within it. He had to attend the dinners, participate in the conversations, understand the cultural references, share, to the extent that refusing would appear strange, the material pleasures that Parisian professional life offered in casual abundance, the restaurants, the wines, the shops, the extraordinary physical quality of the city itself. The gap between that world and the one he would return to at the end of his posting was not abstract. It was measured in the straightforward availability of things that were rationed, scarce, or entirely absent in Moscow. Among the contacts Vetrov developed during his Paris years was a French businessman named Jacques Prévost. Prévost worked in a commercial sector that brought him into regular professional contact with Soviet trading representatives, and his acquaintance with Vetrov developed across several years of professional overlap into what both men appear to have experienced as a genuine personal friendship: shared dinners, attendance at professional events in one another's company, correspondence maintained during intermittent separations. From the Soviet institutional perspective, the relationship with Prévost was an unremarkable feature of operational cover. Line X officers were expected to cultivate exactly this kind of social contact, and Prévost's profile, a French businessman with legitimate commercial reasons to engage with Soviet trading representatives, represented a normal professional acquaintance. From Prévost's perspective, it was simply what it appeared to be. The circumstances of Vetrov's recall to Moscow in 1970 are not fully transparent in available documentation. Some accounts of the case, drawing on sources within the French and Russian intelligence communities, suggest that behavioral observations during his Paris years, or reporting from colleagues monitoring him under standard internal counterintelligence protocols, had generated questions about his reliability that prompted his removal from the foreign posting before its originally intended conclusion. If such concerns were formally registered in his file, they did not produce immediate consequences for his career. He was assigned to Directorate T upon his return, continuing his professional work within the First Chief Directorate in an analytical and administrative capacity, rather than as a deployed field officer. But without a foreign posting, the specific professional satisfactions that had distinguished his earlier career were unavailable to him, and what replaced them was the institutional life of Moscow, the bureaucratic environment, the internal politics, and the slow accumulation of evidence that the trajectory of his advancement had reached its ceiling. The 1970s were years of accumulating professional dissatisfaction that is established across multiple accounts and by Vetrov's own later communications with French intelligence, portions of which have been disclosed in the decades since the operation was acknowledged. He had reached the career stage at which the limits of his advancement within the KGB's institutional structure had become visible and fixed. He was experienced, technically knowledgeable, and capable of the analytical work his position required, but advancement within the First Chief Directorate depended as much on institutional politics, the cultivation of senior patrons, the navigation of factional dynamics within a hierarchy that was simultaneously an intelligence agency and a government ministry, as on professional performance, and an officer whose Paris years had generated questions, whose alcohol consumption had been noted in personnel evaluations, and who had not built the political relationships that senior advancement required, was not an officer whose career would continue to rise. By the mid to late 1970s, this appears to have been clear to Vetrov himself. The alcohol problem was documented in internal KGB personnel evaluations. By the mid-1970s, described in the characteristically restrained language of Soviet institutional documentation as a professional concern warranting monitoring, without rising to the level of a recommendation for separation from service. By the later years of the decade, Vetrov was also involved in a romantic relationship outside his marriage, a circumstance that created precisely the kind of personal vulnerability that counterintelligence professionals identified as an exposure risk. The picture that emerges from the available accounts of his personal and professional circumstances in 1979 and 1980 is of a man whose relationship with the institution he had served for 20 years had eroded in ways that the ordinary incentives of professional life could no longer contain. In the autumn of 1980, Jacques Prévost traveled to Moscow on commercial business. He and Vetrov arranged to meet across several evenings of dinner, as they had done periodically across the decades since the Paris years. The meetings were qualitatively different from earlier encounters, and Prévost registered the difference immediately. Vetrov spoke with an openness about the Soviet system that exceeded anything he had expressed in prior conversations, about the corruption he observed in his professional environment, described in specific rather than generalized terms, about the gap between official claims regarding Soviet technological progress and the reality he observed from within the intelligence apparatus, tasked with compensating for that gap through foreign collection, about his own career and what it had failed to become, expressed in the particular bitter clarity of a man who had stopped managing appearances. At some point during these conversations, Vetrov indicated with sufficient deliberateness that Prévost could not interpret it as anything other than what it was, that he might be prepared to provide information to French intelligence. The indication was not naive and was not impulsive. Vetrov was an experienced intelligence professional who had spent 20 years studying how recruitment approaches worked and what distinguished genuine approaches from controlled provocations. He knew what he was doing when he said what he said, and he appears to have said it with full awareness of what discovery would mean. He was making a decision that had probably been forming across years rather than evenings, and making it through the one channel available to him, a friendship with a Western national who he understood would know how to report what he had been told. Prévost returned to France and contacted the Direction de la Surveillance du Territoire, the DST, France's domestic counterintelligence service, and reported the conversation. The DST began its evaluation of the approach. The assessment was careful and took account of the obvious alternative that a Soviet intelligence officer's approach to a French citizen was a controlled provocation a KGB orchestrated operation designed to surface French intelligence contacts or map DST handling methods. What argued against this interpretation was the quality of accumulated personal conviction in Vetrov's criticisms of the Soviet system, which Prévost, who had known the man across 15 years, recognized as genuine and recently intensified rather than rehearsed. The operational logic of using Prévost, a business acquaintance with no documented intelligence exposure, as the contact point, and the professional position Vetrov held within Directorate T, which meant that if the approach was authentic, what he might provide could be of exceptional value to the Western intelligence community. The DST concluded the approach was genuine and established an operational structure. Vladimir Vetrov was assigned the code name Farewell. Prévost agreed to serve as intermediary, using his established commercial relationship with Soviet trading organizations as cover for continued visits to Moscow. A DST handling officer was assigned to the case, receiving material from Prévost before and after his Moscow visits and providing operational direction. The arrangement was unconventional by standard doctrine, which called for minimizing the number of individuals in any asset relationship, but Vetrov's location inside the Soviet Union and his inability to travel made the intermediary structure the most workable available option. Between the early months of 1981 and February 1982, Vladimir Vetrov provided the DST with documentation that altered in fundamental ways what the Western intelligence community understood about how the Cold War was actually being prosecuted in the domain of science and technology. The materials he passed through Prévost and the French handling apparatus included the identities of approximately 250 KGB scientific and technical intelligence officers posted throughout the Western world under diplomatic, commercial, and academic cover, men and women who had been operating within Western defense industries, research universities, and government laboratories for years, in many cases for the entirety of their careers, without being identified by the counterintelligence services of the countries in which they worked. Vetrov named them. He provided their cover identities, their institutional affiliations, their operational roles within the Line X structure, and in many cases the specific networks of contacts and sources they had developed. Beyond the personnel identifications, he provided the internal planning documents of Directorate T that described Soviet technological collection priorities in order of urgency: radar systems, guidance technology, materials science, semiconductor manufacturing processes, computer hardware and software with military applications, allowing Western intelligence analysts to understand not merely what had been stolen in the past, but what Soviet intelligence would most aggressively seek in the years ahead. He provided internal assessments of what Line X operations had already successfully obtained across the preceding decade, a retrospective inventory of Western technological losses that allowed counterintelligence services to begin tracing back operations that had gone entirely undetected. The total volume of documentation reached approximately 4,000 photographed items and dozens of rolls of microfilm across the operational period. The collection mechanics required Vetrov to photograph documents from files accessible through his position in Directorate T, using a small camera of the kind standard to operational photography of this type, and to synchronize the transfer of film with Prévost's commercially motivated visits to Moscow. The meetings between the two men were documented in Vetrov's personnel file as the routine continuation of a long-standing social acquaintance with a foreign business contact, exactly what they had been for 15 years before the operational relationship began. Prévost carried the material out of the Soviet Union during his commercial travel departures, traveling as a French businessman whose profile gave no indication that warranted intensive customs examination. The arrangement operated for the length of the operational period without detection by any Soviet security mechanism. The motivations that led Vetrov to accept these risks were not reducible to a single explanation, and the intelligence professionals who managed the case have consistently resisted the impulse to reduce them. He spoke to his handlers of genuine ideological disillusionment, a conviction formed across 2 decades of professional observation and shaped significantly by his years in Paris, that the Soviet system he had served had betrayed the principles that might have given it moral authority, and that its claims about itself were systematically false in ways he had privately understood for a long time. He spoke of professional frustration, of an institution that had formed him and then set limits on him that his abilities had not earned, and the relationship itself provided something beyond ideology or money, the experience of being sought out and valued by an institution that treated his contributions as uniquely significant at a point in his career when his own institution had stopped offering that experience. The financial compensation he received was modest, cash payments and consumer goods of the kind that carried both practical value and social significance within the Soviet economy, but it was secondary to something more difficult to name. On the evening of February 23, 1982, the operational period ended. The date was Defender of the Fatherland Day, the Soviet calendar's annual observance of the military, a public holiday on which Muscovites were found in parks, public spaces, and in one another's apartments in the informal gatherings the occasion encouraged. Bitsevsky Forest Park, in the city's southwestern Karyamushki district, drew the kind of visitors that city parks draw on winter holidays: couples seeking relative privacy, individuals seeking quiet, families passing through on evening walks. The park's interior roads were poorly lit after dark and were not heavily traveled by pedestrians in the February cold. Vetrov was in the park that evening with a woman who was not his wife. The two were in his car along one of the park's interior roads when they were encountered by a man known to Vetrov. Available accounts of the case describe the encounter and its escalation, but the identities of both victims, the man who was killed first and the woman who died as a witness, have not been established with certainty in publicly available English-language documentation. The Kostin Renaud biography of Vetrov, which is the primary detailed account of the case, identifies the male victim in terms consistent with a personal or professional acquaintance, but the names of both individuals remain unconfirmed across multiple independent sources. This is not an editorial oversight. It reflects a genuine limitation in the publicly available record, where the victims of the night that exposed Farewell have been largely absent from the historical literature that has focused, as intelligence history tends to focus, on operational rather than human consequences. What is established by multiple accounts and by the subsequent criminal proceedings is the sequence of events. The confrontation between Vetrov and the man escalated into violence rapidly and without apparent premeditation. Vetrov, who had consumed alcohol that evening, attacked the man with a knife. The man died at the scene. The woman, who had witnessed the killing at close range, was also stabbed and also died. Vetrov did not leave. He did not attempt to move the bodies to dispose of the knife, or to alter the scene in any way that might have provided a more defensible account of what had occurred. The emergency call that brought militia officers to the park road was made by a passerby who had heard or witnessed some portion of the altercation. The call was logged at approximately 9:22 p.m. The first militia unit arrived at the scene approximately 18 minutes later. By the time the officers reached the interior road where the car was parked, Vetrov was standing beside it, making no effort to conceal himself or to alter what surrounded him. He was standing, according to the militia first response report, with his hands visible and his demeanor controlled. He provided his identification documents when asked. He was detained, transported to militia custody, and formally arrested on charges of double homicide before midnight of February 23, 1982. The initial investigation was conducted as what it presented itself as, a serious criminal case with the suspect in custody and the fundamental facts not in dispute. Vetrov's KGB employment was noted in preliminary arrest documentation, and the first chief directorate was notified through the standard channel by which the KGB was informed when any of its personnel became involved in criminal proceedings with civilian authorities. This notification did not trigger an immediate review of Vetrov's professional activities. The charge was murder. There was no national security dimension visible to anyone processing the case from outside the classification level at which Vetrov's actual activities had been occurring. Vetrov exercised his right to limit cooperation with investigators and to decline to answer questions beyond what the initial detention required. His legal representation offered arguments at pretrial hearings that characterized the confrontation in the park as having been provoked and the escalation as having exceeded what he had intended. The investigative and prosecutorial apparatus did not find these arguments sufficient to alter the fundamental charge or the evidence supporting it. Vladimir Vetrov was tried before the Moscow City Court in the early autumn of 1982. The trial lasted several days. The prosecution presented physical evidence from the crime scene, forensic documentation of the cause of death for both victims, and testimony from individuals who had been in the vicinity of the park that evening. The defense restated its arguments regarding provocation and the unpremeditated character of the escalation. The court did not find these mitigating arguments sufficient to reduce the severity of the charge. Vetrov was convicted on both counts of the indictment and sentenced to 12 years in a corrective labor colony, to be served at a facility in the Soviet penal system designated for his term. He was transported and began serving his sentence in late 1982. He appears to have been unaware that a second investigation of an entirely different character was simultaneously beginning. The process by which the KGB's internal counterintelligence apparatus came to understand what Vetrov had done during the operational period has not been fully reconstructed in any publicly available source, and the accounts that exist are not entirely consistent with one another. Several point to the review of his personal property and records, conducted as a procedural consequence of the murder conviction and the post-arrest administrative process, as the origin of the anomalies that directed internal investigators toward a more intensive examination. Items recovered from his apartment and personal effects during this review were inconsistent with what his official duties and salary could explain. Evidence of contact with foreign nationals that exceeded the documented scope of his professional responsibilities, financial irregularities not accountable by his official income, and photographic equipment inconsistent with personal hobby use. Other accounts suggest that intelligence from a separate, unidentified source provided the initial indicator that directed attention toward Vetrov specifically. A third possibility, the behavioral observations accumulated in the months before the Bitsevsky Park incident had generated internal concerns that the murder arrest made it now both possible and necessary to pursue, is consistent with what is known and cannot be dismissed. What is established is that by late 1982, the KGB's second chief directorate, responsible for internal counterintelligence, was conducting a classified investigation into Vetrov's activities during his period of access to Line X documentation. The investigation focused on reconciling his official access logs and personnel records with what investigators now suspected had been systematically extracted from KGB files through unauthorized photography. This is painstaking work under any circumstances. Within a paper-based record system, the primary medium of Soviet bureaucratic documentation in this period, demonstrating that specific documents had been photographed without authorization, required extensive methodical cross-referencing. Access logs checked against documentary states at specific dates, patterns distinguished from the ordinary movement of files through institutional channels, discrepancies examined for the multiple innocent explanations that had to be eliminated before an unauthorized one could be established. The investigation also examined with particular attention Vetrov's contact with foreign nationals across the preceding decade. The relationship with Jacques Prévost, documented in his personnel file as a social contact developed during the Paris posting, an unremarkable feature of an intelligence officer's professional history, now attracted scrutiny of an entirely different character. Records of Prévost's visits to Moscow were located and their dates established. The correspondence between those visit dates and anomalies in Directorate T's documentary records was mapped against each other. Financial records were examined for income not accountable by Vetrov's official salary. Physical items recovered during the post-arrest review of his personal property were subjected to forensic examination that went considerably beyond the initial inventory. By early 1983, the internal investigation had assembled evidence sufficient to conclude that Vladimir Vetrov had conducted systematic espionage on behalf of French intelligence across an extended period while serving in a position with access to some of the most sensitive documentation held within the First Chief Directorate. The damage assessment that followed this conclusion was, by the standards of any intelligence service that has experienced a penetration, severe. The consequences materialized publicly on April 5, 1983, when the French government announced the expulsion from France of 47 Soviet diplomatic officials. The French Foreign Ministry stated that these individuals had been engaged in activities incompatible with their diplomatic status. The standard formulation used when a government expels intelligence officers without presenting detailed public evidence. The officials were given 48 hours to depart the country. The expulsion of 47 individuals in a single coordinated action was not a number that resulted from routine counterintelligence work, from the patient accumulation of surveillance evidence across many separate investigations conducted over years. Every intelligence professional in the relevant services understood within hours of the announcement that a number of that scale and a coordination of that completeness reflected the product of a source, someone inside the Soviet intelligence apparatus who had provided identifications specific and complete enough to allow French counterintelligence to act against nearly 50 targets simultaneously rather than building individual cases across years. The Soviet residency in Paris, among the most active KGB presences in Western Europe, was effectively dismantled within 48 hours of the announcement. Each of those 47 individuals represented years of training, carefully constructed cover, developed networks of contacts and access, and operational infrastructure built through patient work over extended periods. All of it was terminated in a single action on a Friday in April 1983. The intelligence that enabled this action had not been confined to France. In July 1981, at the G7 summit, held at the Montebello Conference Center in the province of Quebec, approximately 130 kilometers from Ottawa, French President François Mitterrand had met privately with President Ronald Reagan. Mitterrand personally briefed the American president on the intelligence France had received from an asset inside Soviet scientific and technical intelligence, and France subsequently shared the documentation with American intelligence services. The briefing at Montebello and the materials that followed it were later described by participants on both sides as among the most significant intelligence transactions of the Cold War period. The CIA conducted its own assessment of the farewell materials in parallel with the French analysis and reached similar conclusions regarding both the authenticity of the intelligence and the scale of what it revealed. The materials allowed intelligence and law enforcement agencies across Allied governments to begin systematically dismantling what had been, for years, an almost entirely invisible Soviet technological acquisition operation. In the United States, Operation Exodus, an enhanced export control enforcement program targeting Soviet acquisition of controlled technologies through commercial channels, was implemented in part on the specific knowledge of what materials Soviet intelligence was seeking and through what channels it was attempting to obtain them. The number of export control enforcement actions pursued by the United States Department of Justice increased substantially in 1983 and across the following years, with investigators working from an operational picture of Soviet acquisition methods and priorities that Vetrov's materials had provided. Allied governments across Western Europe implemented parallel security reviews, restructured protection procedures at defense-related research institutions, and identified ongoing Soviet collection efforts that had previously escaped detection entirely. Thomas Reed, who served on the Reagan National Security Council staff during this period, later wrote in his memoirs that the exploitation of farewell intelligence extended to the introduction of deliberately corrupted technical information into Soviet acquisition channels, including software destined for a Siberian natural gas pipeline control system, and that this sabotage produced a significant explosion in the Siberian wilderness in 1982. This account has been disputed by multiple former senior intelligence officials from both the CIA and Allied Western services. No independent corroborating documentation supporting Reed's specific claims has been released from any government archive as of the date of this writing. It is presented here as a contested claim advanced by one named source, not as an established fact of the farewell case. What is not contested, and what the documentary record of the period establishes without ambiguity, is that the farewell materials were used aggressively and systematically by Allied governments throughout 1982 and the years that immediately followed. While these consequences were unfolding in Paris, in Washington, and across the intelligence services of Allied nations throughout 1983, Vladimir Vetrov remained in the Soviet corrective labor system serving his murder sentence. The KGB's internal counterintelligence investigation was being conducted at a classification level, wholly inaccessible to an imprisoned former officer. His legal representation had no information about any parallel inquiry into his professional activities. His family received no notification from any institutional source that anything beyond the existing murder conviction was under review. The decision to pursue treason charges against Vetrov, in addition to the murder conviction he was already serving, was made by KGB and Soviet state authorities during 1983. The prosecution that followed was conducted before a military tribunal in 1984 under conditions of strict security. Soviet military tribunal proceedings in espionage cases during this period were not public proceedings in any sense recognizable to Western legal traditions. There was no public record of the evidence presented, no transcript accessible to outside parties, no published account of arguments made or reasoning offered. The institutional interest in conviction was structurally embedded in the proceedings in ways that made the outcome effectively determined in advance of any formal adjudication. The prosecution presented evidence of Vetrov's sustained contact with Prevost across the operational period, the financial dimensions of the relationship, and the materials recovered through the internal investigation. Vetrov was convicted of treason against the Soviet Union. He was sentenced to death by shooting. The sentence was carried out on January 23, 1985. He was 52 years old. The French government made no official public acknowledgement of the farewell operation at the time of Vetrov's execution. The DST officers who had managed the case maintained the confidentiality appropriate to an intelligence achievement whose operational and diplomatic implications had not diminished with the asset's death. The Soviet government had comprehensive reasons of its own to avoid publicizing what had occurred. To acknowledge the breach fully would have required acknowledging the penetration of Directorate T by a Western counterintelligence service, the exposure of an operational network representing decades of institutional investment, and the failure of counterintelligence systems the KGB formally presented to its own government as impenetrable. Public acknowledgement came gradually across the following decade. Mitterrand addressed the farewell operation in his published memoirs and in interviews during the early 1990s. The CIA formally acknowledged receiving the farewell intelligence from France and incorporating it into policy assessments that shaped Reagan administration decisions across multiple domains. The biography written by Sergei Kostin and Eric Reynaud, drawing on access to Russian archival sources and original interviews with individuals involved in the case on both sides, provided the most comprehensive reconstruction of the operation's mechanics and personnel that has been published in any language, and it remains the primary detailed source for the events described in this account. The film L'Affaire Farewell, directed by Christian Carillon and released in France in 2009, dramatized the case for a general audience. It is a work of cinema incorporating fictional elements and should not be treated as a documentary source. Svetlana Vetrov had no knowledge of her husband's espionage activities during the period he conducted them. What the murder conviction of the summer of 1982 had required of her was already significant. The process of reconceiving a marriage and a person she had known across more than 20 years in the light of violent acts she could not have predicted and had not been given any way to anticipate. She had navigated the social position of being the wife of a convicted murderer, a position that Soviet institutional life understood how to classify, even if it offered no support for the person classified within it. By continuing her professional work, managing the practical dimensions of a household that had been comprehensively altered by his arrest, and providing as much stability as the circumstances allowed for their son, who was 11 years old when his father was taken from the apartment building by militia officers in February 1982. Then had come the second proceedings, the second conviction, and the execution. The family members of individuals executed for treason occupied, in Soviet social life, a position of permanent institutional and social consequence that the state did not formally codify in its legal framework, but that pervaded every dimension of institutional interaction. Employment in sectors touching on state security or sensitive areas of the professional economy was effectively closed to them. Apartment assignments, the allocation of educational opportunities, the professional prospects of children, all of these were inflected by the designation that an executed person's conviction had placed on the family name. Association with the family members of a man executed for treason required careful navigation by individuals who valued their own professional standing. None of this was written in any document. All of it was understood in every institutional context. Svetlana had not chosen any of the circumstances that now defined her life. She had not known about the espionage. She had not been consulted. She had not been given the opportunity to make any decision about whether what her husband was doing was something she could accept or remove herself from. She had been living, during the operational period, in a household where the man she was married to conducted an intelligence operation against the Soviet state, while maintaining the full appearance of an ordinary professional and domestic life, without her knowledge, without her consent, and at a personal risk to her that she could not assess because she did not know it existed. The cash that Vetrov had received, the foreign consumer goods, the items that might have seemed at the time like the incidental products of a professional life that included contact with foreign nationals, all of it carried a different meaning now, and she had not been given the option to refuse what she had not been told was occurring. She was now the widow of a man killed by the state he had served and then betrayed. The grief that this produced, for a woman who had lived with him across more than 2 decades, who had raised his child with him, and who had also lost him first to a murder conviction and then to an execution for treason, had no socially acceptable form of expression and no institutional framework within which it could be recognized. The contradiction embedded in her position, the impossibility of public mourning for a man executed as a traitor, and the impossibility of entirely private mourning for a man who had occupied the center of her adult life, did not resolve over time. It became the permanent architecture of a life altered without her agency. Their son, Vladik, was 11 years old when his father was detained on the evening of February 23, 1982, and taken into militia custody on charges of double homicide. He was 12 years old when Vladimir Vetrov was convicted in the Moscow City Court and transported to a corrective labor facility to begin serving a 12-year sentence. He was 14 years old when the Soviet state executed his father for treason on January 23, 1985. The 3 years between the arrest and the execution constituted the core of his early adolescence, the years during which the formation of identity and a sense of one's place in the world occurs with a particular intensity and a particular vulnerability that makes losses during this period unusually difficult to recover from. During those 3 years, the father that Vladik had known as a child was transformed. In the public record and in the social consciousness of the Soviet world, he inhabited daily, first into a convicted murderer and then into an executed traitor. These were not abstract designations in the institutional environment of Soviet life. They were categories that followed a family the way a file follows a case through an administrative system. Teachers in Soviet schools understood what the family background of a student whose father had been executed for treason meant for that student's institutional future. School administrators understood it. The parents of other children absorbed it and communicated it to their children in the ways that adults communicate these things, and other children brought it into the daily social environment of Vladik's school years in ways that were not subtle, were not brief, and were not without consequence. Vladik navigated this environment through his early adolescence without the father whose arrest had created the circumstances he was navigating, without institutional support of any kind, and within a family whose own grief had no sanctioned form of expression. The specific dimensions of what he experienced through his teenage years and into adulthood have not been documented in publicly available sources in the detail that his situation would warrant. He has remained largely outside public view in the decades since the case became historically acknowledged, a characteristic outcome for the children of individuals executed for state crimes in the Soviet system, where the institutional preference was for the entire episode and everyone connected to it to recede without further documentation. What researchers who have examined the case indicate is that Vladik came to understand the full scope of his father's activities not through his mother, who may not herself have had access to a complete picture until Western accounts of Farewell began to circulate through channels accessible to Soviet readers in the late 1980s. But through the gradual emergence of information as the Soviet state's official silence on the case eroded, and as the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 loosened the institutional controls that had kept the full dimensions of the case from public circulation, the process by which a child, now an adolescent, now a young adult, integrates the understanding that the father he remembered from childhood was simultaneously a man who killed two people in a park, a man who committed systematic espionage against the state for which he worked, and a man who was executed by that state for it, while also having been, from the perspective of an 11-year-old living in the same apartment, simply a father who came home in the evenings, ate dinner at the family table, and existed in the ordinary domestic texture that children inhabit without analysis, is not a process that arrives at resolution. Each layer of understanding does not replace the previous one. It accumulates alongside it. The father of memory and the man of historical record occupy the same psychological space without resolution, and the work of holding both simultaneously is not a task that ends. It is the kind of cognitive and emotional labor that marks the entirety of an adult life, rather than reaching a conclusion within it. Jacques Prévost, whose friendship with Vetrov across 15 years had provided the operational foundation for the Farewell relationship, was never charged with any offense in France. He had acted as a French citizen was obligated to act, reporting a foreign intelligence officer's approach to his country's security services and cooperating in the management of what followed. The role he played required a degree of composure and operational steadiness that intelligence professionals who have examined the case have noted with respect, maintaining the appearance of an unchanged social relationship with a man he was simultaneously helping to run as an intelligence asset, carrying film out of the Soviet Union during commercial travel departures, meeting with DST handling contacts before and after his Moscow visits, sustaining this across the full operational period without any of it becoming visible to the KGB counterintelligence that would have been monitoring foreign nationals' contacts with Soviet intelligence personnel. His role in the operation became publicly known gradually as accounts were published during the late 1980s and 1990s, and as the declassification of the Farewell case progressed. Prévost gave limited interviews, avoided public attention, and carried into later life the particular knowledge that a report he had made and an intermediary role he had played were links in a chain that ended with the death of a man he had genuinely known across 15 years. Whether this knowledge sat easily is not documented. The DST officers who designed and managed the Farewell operation received recognition within the French intelligence community that was necessarily private rather than public for many years following Vetrov's execution. The achievement they had produced, assessing the authenticity of an approach from inside Soviet intelligence, constructing a workable operational structure for an asset who could not leave the Soviet Union, managing the relationship across the full operational period without triggering KGB detection, and successfully processing intelligence of exceptional quality, represented professional accomplishment of a level that intelligence services acknowledge only within their own institutional cultures. The operational period produced approximately 4,000 document photographs passed through a commercial intermediary from inside the Technical Intelligence Directorate of the Soviet Union's own foreign intelligence apparatus, without detection at any stage. By any standard of professional assessment, this is extraordinary. The strategic consequences of the Farewell operation extended across the final decade of the Cold War in ways that are documented even where their specific causal connections to particular decisions are difficult to establish with precision. The immediate operational impact was severe. the effective neutralization of the Line X officer network across Western Europe, the dismantling of collection infrastructure that Soviet intelligence rebuilt across the following years under conditions of substantially greater Western counterintelligence scrutiny, and the provision to Allied governments of an operational picture of Soviet scientific and technical collection methods that transformed counterintelligence practice across the alliance. Operation Exodus produced a measurable increase in export control enforcement actions in the years following the dissemination of Vetrov's intelligence. Security procedures at Western defense research institutions were restructured in ways directly traceable to the specific knowledge of Soviet collection methods that the farewell materials provided. These are concrete, documented outcomes. Beyond the immediate operational consequences, the farewell intelligence gave Western policymakers a retrospective picture of how successfully Soviet scientific and technical collection had been operating for the decade preceding the operation, a picture that significantly altered official estimates of Soviet military capability and of the gap between what the Soviet military-industrial complex could produce indigenously and what it had been quietly obtaining through intelligence collection. The revision of these estimates informed procurement decisions, research priorities, and strategic planning across Allied governments throughout the 1980s in ways that the intelligence assessments of the period document, even where the specific downstream effects cannot be isolated with the precision that definitive historical judgment would require. Whether the farewell intelligence influenced specific military or strategic outcomes in ways that can be isolated and measured is a question the available historical record cannot answer with precision. Intelligence operates through accumulation and synthesis, and tracing any specific decision to any specific intelligence input is rarely possible in retrospect. What can be established is that the materials Vetrov provided shaped the intelligence assessments that informed Western policy during a strategic phase of the Cold War competition, the early 1980s, in which the trajectory of that competition was approaching a critical juncture. The code name that the DST assigned in early 1981, Farewell, was selected for reasons of operational convenience, as all such designations are, without any reference to the futures of the people involved in the operation it named. Its aptness, visible only in retrospect, was entirely accidental and entirely complete. The operation ended in the way it suggested. The man at its center ended in the way it suggested, and the Cold War context that had made both possible was itself, within 6 years of Vetrov's execution, beginning the process of ending, the Soviet Union dissolving from the inside in ways that Vetrov, in his disillusionment across the years he had served it, may have understood was coming, even if he could not have anticipated the specific form it would take. The broader question that the Vetrov case raises is one that resists the frameworks within which intelligence history is conventionally assessed, frameworks designed to evaluate operational success, strategic impact, and institutional performance, in which Farewell scores at the highest level across every relevant measure. Those frameworks are adequate for accounting for what Vetrov provided and what was done with it. They are inadequate for accounting for the people who inhabited the margins of the case, the people who bore its consequences without having had any role in creating them. Svetlana Vetrov navigated a social landscape that offered no framework for the situation she had been placed in and no language for what she was required to process. Their son Vladek navigated his adolescence and early adulthood, carrying a history he had not chosen, in a society that had decided what that history meant, with a name that preceded him into every institutional interaction of his life. The two people who died in Bitsevsky Forest Park on the evening of February 23, 1982, whose deaths were the direct and immediate cause of the operation's exposure, whose murders, committed in a park on a winter public holiday, constituted the thread that Soviet investigators pulled until the entire fabric of Vetrov's operational life unraveled, are almost entirely absent from the historical literature of the Farewell case. The intelligence history focuses, as intelligence history tends to focus, on operational scope and strategic consequence, rather than on the human cost of a night in a park that was not, in any intelligent sense, part of any operation at all. The question of how responsibility distributes in a case like this does not resolve into a clean answer, and it should not be forced into one. Vladimir Vetrov chose to commit espionage. He bore responsibility for that choice. He chose to commit violence against two people who had no relationship to any intelligence operation. He bore responsibility for that as well. Those choices were his, made with the awareness and deliberateness of a man who had spent 20 years inside an institution whose fundamental business was understanding exactly this kind of decision and its consequences. But he made those choices within an institution that had formed him and then limited him in ways he believed his abilities had not earned, within a professional life whose trajectory had foreclosed options he had once expected to reach, within a personal life that had accumulated pressures and failures over years without resolution, and within a historical competition between systems that treated individual human beings, their access, their disillusionment, their resentments, their professional frustrations, their loneliness, their need to feel valued by someone or something, as resources to be identified, developed, and converted into intelligence product. The Cold War's intelligence apparatus on both sides of the competition was premised on the recognition that human vulnerabilities were operational assets. Vetrov's vulnerabilities were real. The institution that ultimately exploited them was not the KGB. The systems do not disappear from the accounting simply because the individual made the final decision. Vladimir Vetrov was buried in Moscow following his execution in January 1985. The Soviet government made no public acknowledgement of the scale of what he had done or the nature of the intelligence catastrophe his choices had set in motion. The circumstances of his burial, whether his grave was marked, whether his family was permitted access to it, what if anything was said, have not been documented in available sources. He had served Soviet intelligence for more than 20 years and had then, across 14 months in 1981 and 1982, provided the institution's primary Western adversary with the most comprehensive picture of its scientific and technical intelligence operations that any source had ever delivered. He had killed two people in a Moscow park and stood beside their bodies until militia officers arrived. He had been convicted of murder and then of treason. He had been executed by the state he had served and betrayed. What he had thought about all of this during the 3 years between his arrest and his execution is not documented. He did not have the opportunity available to some individuals at the center of cases like this to give interviews to researchers decades later, to reflect publicly on motivations and consequences, to offer his own accounting of what his choices had meant and what they had cost. He was executed in his early 50s in a Soviet prison facility, without the passage of time that might have allowed him to see, from outside his own perspective, what his operational work had produced in the world. The 47 Soviet diplomats expelled from Paris on a Friday in April 1983. The Western security measures restructured on the basis of what he had provided, the intelligence assessments that shaped policy decisions across Allied governments during the final decade of the Cold War. Robert Chambers, the American engineer whose espionage case anchors the reference this account has been constructed against, was 37 years old when the photograph was taken in Rock Creek Park. He was 74 years old when he died in 2014. In the decades between those points, he had time to reflect, to give interviews, to speak about what he had done and why he had done it, to describe the damage to his family, to acknowledge that he could not identify any positive consequence that justified what his choices had cost. Vladimir Vetrov had none of that time. Vladimir Vetrov was 49 years old when he stood beside two bodies in Bitsevsky Forest Park in southwestern Moscow on the evening of February 23, 1982, and waited for militia officers to arrive. He was 52 years old when the Soviet state executed him on January 23, 1985, for what he had done in the 14 months before that night. And in the 3 years between those two events, he lost everything: his freedom, his marriage, the ordinary domestic life of a Soviet professional apartment in a residential district of Moscow, the relationship with a son who was 11 years old when his father was arrested and 14 when the state killed him, and any possibility of understanding from outside his own closed perspective, what his choices had meant. Vladek Vetrov was 11 years old when his father was arrested. He was 12 when his father was convicted and transported to a Soviet penal facility. He was 14 when the state executed him. And in between, in the years that followed, he carried the weight of a history he had not chosen, in a society that had determined what that history meant, with a name that arrived before him in every room he entered for the rest of his life.